Hi, I'm Jose Pedreira, and welcome back to El Bohio Mío. Now, in the last episode, I finished up by talking about how Christopher Columbus had returned two Taino Indian girls who had been captured by the Caribe Indians back to Puerto Rico and then sailed on to discover Hispaniola, or the Dominican Republic. It was another 11 years before a Spaniard stepped foot on Puerto Rico, and that was Yanez Pinzon in 1504. Pinzon introduced horses and livestock to the island, but then left for Brazil. It was 4 years later, in 1508, that Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Puerto Rico and set about colonizing the island with 42 Spaniards. Now, I've got to say that these Spaniards had an immense amount of audacity. Personally, I would say they had huge nads. Because the first thing Ponce did was to distribute the Taino land among the Spanish colonists. And even more audaciously, he distributed the Taino Indians themselves to the colonists as encomendados, or forced laborers. The Spanish, being in charge of the Taino, were called the encomenderos, and the whole thing was called the encomienda. Not comemienda, encomienda. Now, the Spanish, being the sticklers they were for legality, couldn't call the Indians slaves because they weren't bought and sold on the slave market. So they came up with the encomienda to make everything right with the world. Being encomendados meant that the Indians, Taino and Caribe alike, had to work for their masters by building roads, working the fields, and most importantly, working the gold mines of Puerto Rico. So ruthless were the Spaniards that those mines were stripped completely bare. And as far as I know, not a nugget of gold can be found in the hills or rivers of Puerto Rico today. Now, in exchange for their hard labor, the Indians were supposed to be given food, clothing, lodging, and a Christian education. Unfortunately, when there were food shortages, the Indians were forced to eat grass. We'll say more about that in a later episode. Now, in any other case, I would say that the Spaniards were a product of their times. That they had slaves in Spain and therefore treated the Indians the same way. Except that the Indians were not part of the slave trade. They were not purchased and weren't the property of the Spanish. The Spanish simply took it upon themselves to take the land as their own and brutally enslave the Indians. There was no precedent for this, so I can't find an excuse for this behavior. And when word of the brutality got back to Spain, many Spanish people were horrified and angered. But Ponce and others like him, being too far away to feel the pain, did pretty much as they felt. Oh, and the encomienda also had the blessing of King Ferdinand. One very interesting thing of note in this story is that the first black man to set foot in the Americas was one of Ponce's 42 passengers. His name was Juan Garrido. Garrido was born in Angola, Africa, but had lived for years in Sevilla, where he obtained his freedom and became a Christian. Garrido also formed part of De Leon's expedition to Florida. So in all likelihood, he was the first black man to ever set foot on what would later be the United States of America. Think of the irony. The first black man to set foot in America was a free man. Apparently, he was also quite the explorer and also accompanied Hernan Cortés on his mission of conquest in Mexico. We'll leave things here. In our next episode, there's gold up there in them hills.